White initiates with a solid, establishing central presence and maintaining dynamic balance. This move keeps all options open. Black responds with a sharp Sicilian defense, aiming for dynamic counterplay and maintaining equality. A solid positional choice. White develops the knight too, preparing for kingside castling and controlling central squares. A sound developing move. Black plays, reinforcing the pawn structure and preparing for further development. This move aims for solid defense. White advances, opening the center and creating dynamic possibilities. This central push challenges Black's structure. The move the pawn on the c-file takes on d4 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to a6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White recaptures, developing the knight to a strong central square. This maintains the dynamic balance. Black develops, attacking the central pawn and preparing for castling. A standard developing move for equality. White develops, reinforcing the central pawn and developing another piece. This supports central control. Black plays, a common prophylactic move in the Sicilian, preventing White's pieces from occupying key squares. White develops the bishop too, supporting the center and preparing for castling. This move maintains equality. Black advances, gaining space in the center and opening lines for their pieces. This is a solid move. White retreats, avoiding an exchange and repositioning the knight. This aims to maintain flexibility. Black develops, preparing for kingside castling and improving piece coordination. A solid developing move. White castles kingside, securing the king and activating the rook. A standard defensive maneuver. Black castles kingside, mirroring White's move and ensuring king's safety. This maintains the dynamic balance. White develops, strengthening the pawn chain and preparing for queenside play. A solid centralizing move. Black centralizes the queen too, connecting the rooks and increasing pressure. This supports potential central pawn breaks. White plays, aiming to gain space on the queenside and restrict Black's play. This supports potential pawn advances. Black develops, challenging White's central pawn and preparing for piece exchanges. This aims to improve piece activity. White advances, further restricting Black's queenside space and creating potential weaknesses. This move aims for long-term advantage. Black plays, centralizing the queen and putting pressure on White's queenside. This supports piece activity. White repositions the bishop too, increasing control over central squares and preparing for future advances. The move the knight on the b-file to d7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to c7, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the pawn to h3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight on the b-file to d7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to h6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the f-file to d1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the knight too, occupying a strong outpost and increasing pressure on Black's position. Black captures, exchanging a bishop for a knight, leading to pawn structure changes. This aims for simplification. White recaptures, opening the e-file and creating a strong central pawn presence. This solidifies positional advantage. Black moves the queen too, creating tactical threats and increasing queenside activity. This aims for counterplay. White centralizes the queen too, consolidating the position and preparing for further strategic action. This move bolsters control. Black activates the rook too, contesting the open c-file and increasing queenside pressure. This improves rook placement. The move the rook on the f-file to c1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the f-file to d1, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the queen takes on d3, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to g4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black captures, simplifying the position and reducing white's attacking potential. This aims for piece simplification. White recaptures, establishing a strong central pawn duo and opening lines for the bishop. This creates static advantages. The move the pawn to g6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook takes on c1 with check, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the rook takes on c1, executes a favorable trade, which enables the bishop to d8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to e8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the rook too, contesting the c-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes. This move supports central control. Black captures, exchanging rooks and aiming to simplify the game. This reduces material on the board. White recaptures, creating doubled pawns but opening the b-file and gaining space. This strengthens the pawn structure. Black activates the rook too, contesting the c-file and aiming for increased queenside pressure. This improves rook activity. The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to d2, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the knight to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the knight takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to c4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black pushes, opening lines and creating dynamic imbalances. This move challenges white's central control. White captures, simplifying the pawn structure and opening lines for their pieces. This move maintains dynamic balance. Black recaptures, winning a pawn and gaining a significant positional advantage. This creates an overwhelming advantage. White develops the knight too, repositioning for better defensive coverage and potential counterplay. This improves piece coordination. The move the rook to c2 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to b4, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the rook to c1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the d file takes on c5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to c4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop too, preparing to activate the bishop and improve its scope. This is a solid positional maneuver. Black repositions the rook too, seeking active counterplay and challenging White's structure. This aims to disrupt White's plans. White moves the king too, improving king's safety and preparing for potential rook activity. This reinforces defensive posture. Black develops the knight too, activating the knight and targeting key squares. This increases tactical pressure. White develops the bishop too, reinforcing the center and preparing for exchanges. This move improves piece activity. Black repositions the rook too, challenging White's central pawn and seeking active play. This move creates tactical tension. White captures, exchanging pieces and simplifying the position. This consolidates the slight advantage. Black recaptures, opening lines for the queen and pawn structure. This aims to create passed pawns. White moves the king too, consolidating the king's position and preparing for further endgame play. This improves king activity. The move the rook takes on d2 with check by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to d4, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to d7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the rook takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures, accepting the material advantage and consolidating their dominant position. This move capitalizes on Black's error. Black plays a tactical attempt to regain material, but it is insufficient. This move keeps the game complex. The move the king to c2 by White is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the king to d3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the pawn to c4 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the bishop to f6 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. Black develops, centralizing the knight and improving its attacking potential. This move aims for tactical opportunities. White develops the bishop too, repositioning for better defensive coverage. This improves piece coordination. Black develops, improving the bishop's activity and targeting White's kingside. This move seeks to increase pressure. White plays, activating the rook and preparing for queenside play. This move aims to exploit weaknesses. Black moves the king too, improving king's safety and preparing for central play. This is a prudent king repositioning. The move the king to b3 by White is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to b6, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the king to e7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on a6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the b file takes on a6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on a6, executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black moves the king too, centralizing the king and improving its defensive capabilities. This move enhances king activity. White develops, reinforcing the center and aiming for better bishop placement. This move improves piece activity. Black moves the king to, centralizing the king and preparing for potential pawn advances. This improves king position. White pushes, aiming to gain space on the king side and restrict black's pieces. This move supports central control. Black develops, activating the bishop and targeting white's kingside. This move increases tactical pressure. White moves, activating the rook and preparing for potential pawn advances. This move supports central control. Black develops, challenging white's structure and seeking simplification. This move improves piece activity. The move the pawn to f5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to c2, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to g3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to d4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to d2 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to g5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to f6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to d8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to c2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures, opening lines and improving pawn structure. This move aims to exploit black's weaknesses. Black recaptures, opening the h-file and creating counterplay possibilities. This aims to activate their pieces. White activates the rook to, preparing for queenside infiltration. This move aims to exploit black's king position. Black moves the king to, centralizing the king and seeking safety. This move reinforces the king's position. White moves, increasing pressure on the queenside and preparing for infiltration. This move aims to exploit weaknesses. Black develops, creating tactical threats and putting pressure on white's king. This move aims for counterplay. White pushes, expanding on the kingside and preparing for pawn advances. This move aims to gain space. The move the king to f6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to a1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to g7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to a4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White pushes, creating a passed pawn and expanding on the kingside. This move aims to gain space and initiative. Black moves, activating the bishop and targeting white's kingside. This move aims to create threats. White pushes, creating a passed pawn and expanding on the kingside. This move aims to gain space. The move the king to g5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn on the g-file takes on h5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the rook to a1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the g-file takes on h5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the king to g7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the rook to maintaining pressure on the queenside. This move aims to restrict black's king. Black develops, activating the bishop and creating threats against white's structure. This move aims to counterattack. White moves, centralizing the rook and preparing for further action. This move aims to control key files. Black captures, opening lines and activating the pawn. This move aims to create counterplay. White captures, opening the g-file and creating a passed pawn. This move aims to exploit weaknesses. The move the pawn to c4 with check by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to h6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the king to a4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to e2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to e4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to b3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures, winning another pawn and securing a decisive advantage. This move exploits black's pawn push. Black moves, centralizing the king but keeping it exposed. This move seeks activity but risks safety. White moves, activating the rook and reinforcing the attack. This move aims to exploit the king's position. Black captures, capturing a pawn and activating the king further. This move creates counterplay possibilities. White moves, centralizing the rook and increasing pressure on black's position. This move aims to exploit weaknesses. Black develops, activating the knight and creating counterplay threats. This move aims to disrupt white's attack. White develops, checking the king and forcing it to a more exposed position. This move initiates a tactical sequence. The move the king to g5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to h4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the rook takes on f7, executes a favorable trade, which enables the king to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to d6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures, winning a pawn and consolidating the overwhelming advantage. This move exploits black's king position. The move the bishop to e3 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on a5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the bishop to d3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to d7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to c8 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the rook takes on b7, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White moves, activating the rook and tightening the noose around black's king. This move aims for a decisive attack. Black moves, centralizing the king but exposing it to danger. This move attempts to create counterplay. White develops, reinforcing central control and preparing for a decisive blow. This move improves piece activity. The move the knight to d6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to b6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the knight to d7 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the rook to e4 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. White moves, activating the king and preparing for queenside action. This move aims to exploit black's king position. Black plays, creating potential queenside counterplay but weakening the structure. This move aims to distract white. White captures, eliminating the pawn and opening lines for further attack. This move simplifies the position. Black captures, activating the bishop and creating counterplay threats. This move aims to disrupt white's attack. White captures, winning another pawn and solidifying the decisive advantage. This move exploits black's pawn structure. Black develops, centralizing the bishop and increasing pressure on white's position. This move aims to create threats. White moves, activating the rook and preparing for a decisive attack. This move aims to exploit black's king position. Black develops, centralizing the bishop and preparing for counterplay. This move aims to improve piece activity. White moves, activating the king and preparing for endgame play. This move aims to control key squares. Black develops, retreating the knight to a more defensive square. This move aims to consolidate. White develops, reinforcing central control and preparing for a decisive finish. This move aims to exploit weaknesses. Black develops, activating the bishop and creating counterplay threats. This move aims to disrupt white's attack. White develops, centralizing the bishop and preparing for a decisive attack. This move aims to exploit black's king position. The move the knight to g5 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to a3 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination, paving the way for the king to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to e5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to b1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to g4 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the rook to e4 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. White moves, delivering a decisive blow and winning the game. This move exploits black's tactical misstep. Black plays a tactical maneuver, but it is insufficient to save the game. This move attempts to create complications. The move the king to c6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to b6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to h3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to c6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to a8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to f3 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on d6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the king takes on d6, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the king to f4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to d3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves, delivering a final check and forcing the king to a worse position. This move secures the victory. Black moves, the king's only legal move, placing it in a precarious position. This move delays the inevitable. White develops, positioning the bishop for a decisive mating attack. This move seals the game. Black moves, the king's last attempt to escape, but it is futile. This move signifies resignation. The move the bishop to f5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to g8, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the bishop to b2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the knight to e5 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to d5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the king to g5 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to g5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the rook to e3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to c1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops, delivering checkmate and concluding the game. This move capitalizes on black's exposed king.